The ballroom of the Meridian Grand erupted in laughter when CEO Madeline Whitmore held up an invitation card in front of 300 investors and a wall of cameras. She had personally invited Connor Shaw, a contract elevator mechanic, whose hand still carried the smell of grease, to her pre-IPO gala as the evening's entertainment. Every guest expected him to stumble in, wearing a stained work uniform, confused and out of place. But at exactly 7:12 that evening, a vintage car pulled up to the red carpet, and Connor stepped out in a perfectly tailored suit. The laughter died. The entire room went silent. But to understand why that satisfying moment of silence ever happened, we need to go back to the beginning of that day, and to the woman who made it all possible. Madeline Whitmore had spent 14 years building Meridian Properties into one of the most recognized names in New York real estate. She had closed deals that made front pages, turned abandoned lots into luxury towers, and cultivated an image so polished that even her critics admitted she knew how to command a room. On the morning of the pre-IPO conference, she stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor of Meridian Tower, reviewing the guest list for the evening gala. Every name on that list had been selected with surgical precision: hedge fund managers, board members, city officials, journalists from outlets that mattered. Every seat, every camera angle, every talking point had been choreographed weeks in advance. Madeline did not believe in surprises. She believed in control. But control for Madeline was never just about business. It was about people. Graham Pierce, her executive assistant of 6 years, had watched her turn performance reviews into public spectacles, had seen her humiliate a junior analyst in front of the entire floor for mispronouncing a client's name, had witnessed her reduce a catering manager to tears over a centerpiece arrangement that was 2 inches off spec. Graham had learned to keep his face neutral during these moments. He had also learned that when Madeline smiled a certain way, chin slightly tilted eyes, bright with anticipation, someone was about to become her entertainment. That morning she smiled exactly that way. She called Graham into her office and pointed at a name she had handwritten at the bottom of the guest list: Connor Shaw. Graham recognized the name immediately. Connor was the contract elevator mechanic who had been servicing the building's lifts for the past several months. He was quiet, methodical, and almost invisible. The kind of man who arrived early, did his work without small talk, and left without asking for anything. Graham had noticed one unusual thing about him. Connor kept meticulous notes. Not just standard maintenance logs, but detailed personal records. Dates, serial numbers, inspection results, written in a small notebook he carried in his chest pocket, as if it contained something more valuable than service data. Madeline told Graham to hand-deliver an invitation to Connor before the end of the day. Not a generic printed card, but a formal one, embossed gold-lettered, addressed to him by name. She wanted Connor at the gala as the guest of honor. Graham asked what that meant, and Madeline leaned back in her chair with the look of someone explaining something obvious. She said the media would eat it up a billionaire CEO, inviting a working-class mechanic to sit among the elite. A heartwarming story of corporate inclusivity, right before the IPO. The cameras would capture Connor looking lost, overwhelmed, maybe even grateful. It would be charming. It would go viral. And most importantly, it would make Madeline look like the kind of leader investors wanted to believe in. Graham understood immediately what this actually was. He had seen this pattern before, Madeline selecting someone who could not fight back, placing them in a setting designed to expose the gap between their world and hers, then basking in the contrast. The invitation was not generosity, it was theater. And Connor Shaw was cast as the punchline. What troubled Graham more was something he had not yet told Madeline and did not plan to. 3 weeks earlier, while organizing archived compliance files at Madeline's request, Graham had come across a folder that should have been destroyed years ago. Inside it was a draft version of a maintenance incident report from one of Meridian's early residential projects, the Gramercy Tower. The draft contained a safety warning that did not appear in the final version filed with regulators, and the name on the original crew manifest was Shaw, not Connor. Robert Shaw. Graham had kept a copy. He did not know what he would do with it, but he knew enough about Madeline's world to understand that information was the only currency that could not be devalued. Now, standing in her office, holding an invitation addressed to a man whose last name matched the one in that buried file, Graham felt the ground shift beneath a secret he had been carrying in silence. He found Connor in the basement mechanical room that afternoon, inspecting the hydraulic system of elevator number 4. The space smelled of machine oil and concrete, and the only light came from a caged bulb overhead and the flashlight Connor held between his teeth. Graham handed him the invitation without explanation, just as Madeline had instructed. Connor wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the embossed card, and read it carefully. He did not laugh. He did not look confused. He simply nodded and said he would be there. Graham hesitated. He knew he was crossing a line, but something about the calm in Connor's eyes made him speak. He told Connor quietly that this was not what it looked like, that Madeline had a habit of turning people into spectacles, that the cameras, the seating, the entire setup was designed to make Connor the evening's entertainment, not its guest. Graham said he was telling him this, so Connor could decline with dignity. No hard feelings, no consequences. Connor listened to every word without interrupting. Then he looked at Graham and said something that Graham would remember for a long time. "I know exactly what it is, and I'll be there. Not for her. I have a debt to finish, and I'm going to finish it the right way." Graham did not ask what debt he meant. The look on Connor's face made it clear that the conversation was over. But later that evening, alone in his apartment, Graham made a decision that would change the course of the night. He opened his laptop, created a new encrypted email address, and attached 3 files: the scanned draft of the original maintenance report, the internal email chain showing the safety override had been authorized at the corporate level, and the personnel memo with Robert Shaw's name. He addressed the email to Noah Price, an investigative journalist whose byline Graham had been reading for months in connection with a series on corporate safety failures. Graham did not sign the email. He did not include a note. He simply hit send, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark for a long time. Meanwhile, Noah Price had already been circling Meridian for 4 months. Working from a cramped office above a dry cleaner on 8th Avenue, Noah had started with anonymous tips about a toxic corporate culture, high turnover employees pressured to cut corners, performance reviews used as weapons, standard material for a company sprinting toward an IPO. But 3 weeks ago, a source inside the company had pointed him toward something deeper: a maintenance incident from the Gramercy project, an elevator malfunction whose official record told one story, while the evidence told another. Noah had obtained a partial copy of the original draft report on his own, but it was incomplete enough to confirm that something had been altered, not enough to prove who had authorized it or why. He had been waiting for the missing pieces, and now sitting in his apartment at 6:15 on the evening of Madeline's gala, he opened an anonymous email and found them. The 3 attachments filled every gap in his investigation: the draft report with the safety warning intact, the email chain showing corporate-level authorization of the override, and the name Robert Shaw on a crew manifest that had been scrubbed from the final record. Noah did not know who had sent the files, but he recognized their significance immediately. He grabbed his press credentials and headed for the Meridian Grand. The gala was the story now. Back at Meridian Tower, the afternoon had passed in a blur of preparation. Florists arranged centerpieces in the grand ballroom. A sound crew tested the microphone on the main stage. Security reviewed the entry protocol for VIPs. Hank Morrison, Meridian's board chairman, a tall, silver-haired man who had spent 40 years in corporate governance, arrived early and positioned himself at the back of the ballroom with a glass of sparkling water, watching the setup with the practiced calm of someone who never stood near the spotlight, but always knew where it was pointed. He exchanged a brief nod with Madeline as she crossed the room during her final rehearsal. Their relationship was built on mutual utility. Hank provided institutional credibility, Madeline provided growth, and neither asked the other questions, whose answers might require action. By 6:30, the ballroom was filling. Black cars lined the block outside the Meridian Grand. Investors in tailored suits greeted each other with handshakes that doubled as power assessments. Journalists checked their angles. City officials smiled for the cameras with practiced ease. And at the center of it all, Madeline Whitmore moved through the crowd like she owned the air in the room. The pre-IPO gala was her stage. The investors were her audience. And somewhere out in the city driving toward this building was the man she had chosen to be her prop. What Madeline did not know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that Connor Shaw was not coming to be laughed at. He was coming to settle something that had been waiting years to be settled. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom had settled into its rhythm. Drinks were flowing, conversations were polished, and the collective mood carried the self-satisfied hum of people who believed they belonged exactly where they were. But underneath the pleasantries, a quieter current was running through the room. Anticipation. Word had spread about Madeline's special guest, not through any official announcement, but through the informal network that always moved faster than press releases, whispered jokes between cocktail sips, knowing glances exchanged across tables, and a running bet that had started among a group of junior analysts near the bar. The over-under was on whether the mechanic would show up in his work boots or borrow someone's ill-fitting blazer. One portfolio manager from a midtown hedge fund laughed so hard at his own joke about grease stains on the tablecloth that he nearly spilled his scotch. The cruelty was casual, effortless, the kind that people engaged in without recognizing it as cruelty at all. Madeline had engineered every detail of Connor's arrival experience. His table was positioned near the front of the ballroom, close to the stage, not as a place of honor, but as a display case. 2 camera crews had been briefed to capture his entrance and his reactions throughout the evening. His seat faced the audience, ensuring that every expression on his face would be visible to the room. The chair next to his had been left empty on purpose, because Madeline knew that no one would voluntarily sit beside him, and that empty chair would tell its own story. She had even prepared a short video segment for the screens, a montage of Meridian's everyday heroes, ending with a shot of Connor in his work uniform, meant to contrast with whatever he looked like walking in. It was, in every sense, a stage built for someone else's embarrassment. Graham stood near the service entrance, his phone heavy in his pocket. The email he had sent to Noah Price 3 hours earlier was already in the journalist's hands, and there was no retrieving it. He did not regret the decision, but he felt the weight of it, the understanding that he had set something in motion that could not be stopped, that by morning he would either be vindicated or unemployed or both. He watched the ballroom fill with people whose wealth was built on the assumption that certain truths stayed buried. Tonight, one of those truths was about to walk through the front door. At exactly 7:12, a murmur rippled through the guests standing near the entrance. Through the tall glass doors of the ballroom lobby, a car had pulled up to the red carpet. Not a taxi, not a rideshare, but a dark blue vintage sedan, the kind of vehicle that turned heads, not because it was expensive, but because it was deliberate. The door opened, and Connor Shaw stepped out. He was wearing a charcoal suit, single-breasted with a cut so clean it looked like it had been made for him because it had. His shoes were polished. His posture was straight. His expression carried nothing. No anxiety, no defiance, no eagerness to impress. He looked like a man who had walked into rooms like this before, or at the very least like a man who had never needed a room like this to know his own worth. The laughter stopped. Not all at once, but in a wave starting near the entrance, where people could see him first, then spreading inward as heads turned and conversations trailed off. The junior analysts at the bar put down their drinks. The portfolio manager who had joked about grease stains stared without blinking. The cameras that had been positioned to capture Connor's humiliation captured something else entirely. A man who did not look lost, did not look grateful, and did not look like anyone's punchline. The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when it realizes it has misjudged something fundamental. Madeline saw it from across the ballroom. She was mid-conversation with the CFO of a sovereign wealth fund when she felt the shift, that subtle change in atmospheric pressure that happens when a crowd's attention moves without permission. She turned toward the entrance and saw Connor walking through the ballroom with the kind of measured confidence that cannot be faked. For a fraction of a second, something crossed her face. Not fear, not anger, but the flicker of a person who has pressed a button and is not sure what it activated. She recovered quickly, smiled, and excused herself to greet her guest of honor. Dinner was served at 8. Connor took his assigned seat near the stage without comment. The empty chair beside him did not stay empty for long. A retired federal safety inspector named Arthur Calloway, who had been seated 2 tables away, moved over on his own and introduced himself. The 2 men began talking, and within minutes, the conversation had drawn the attention of everyone within earshot. Connor spoke about elevator safety with a precision that went far beyond what anyone expected from a contract mechanic. He discussed load tolerance thresholds, the difference between traction and hydraulic systems, the statistical failure rates of specific cable configurations, and the regulatory gaps that allowed older buildings to defer critical inspections. He spoke about maintenance cycles not as routine checklists, but as systemic risk assessments, each inspection a data point, each deferred repair a compounding liability. Arthur Calloway leaned forward in his chair, nodding with the recognition of a man who was hearing his own expertise reflected back at him by someone who had lived it from the inside. The guests at adjacent tables began listening, not because anyone told them to, but because Connor's knowledge created a gravity that pulled attention away from the champagne and the small talk. He was not performing. He was not trying to impress. He was simply answering questions with the thoroughness of someone who had spent years caring deeply about something that most people in that room had never thought about. At 8:45, Madeline took the stage for her keynote. The speech was polished, rehearsed, and built around the themes her communications team had crafted for the IPO narrative safety innovation community and trust. She spoke about Meridian's commitment to the highest standards, about how every building they developed was a promise to the people who lived and worked inside it. She used the word integrity 4 times. She used the word accountability 3 times. She gestured toward the room and spoke about the caliber of people Meridian attracted, investors, partners, and even she added with a warm smile, the dedicated workers who kept their buildings running every day. It was meant to be her moment. But as she spoke, something was wrong. The audience was polite, attentive, and completely divided. Half the room was watching Madeline. The other half kept glancing toward the table near the stage where Connor sat with his hands folded, listening with an expression that gave away nothing. The contrast wasn't the one Madeline had planned. She had intended the audience to see a powerful CEO graciously acknowledging a humble worker. Instead, they were seeing a woman talking about safety and integrity, while the man who actually maintained the systems that kept people alive sat quietly below her, radiating a competence that her words could not match. The control she had held all evening was slipping, and she could feel it. After the speech, Madeline approached Connor's table during dessert. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture calibrated to look warm for the cameras, but feel possessive to anyone paying attention, and said loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear that she was genuinely surprised by how well he had adapted to the environment. "I have to admit," she said, smiling at the guests around them, "I didn't expect you to know which fork to use, let alone discuss load-bearing specifications. It's truly refreshing to see someone from your background rise to the occasion like this? The compliment was a knife wrapped in silk, and everyone at the table knew it. Connor looked up at her. He did not stand, did not raise his voice, and did not mirror her smile. He simply said, "I appreciate the invitation, Ms. Whitmore. It's good to finally be in the same room where the decisions get made. Most of the time, the people who deal with the consequences aren't invited to the table." He said it evenly without bitterness, the way a man states a fact he has carried for a long time. The table went silent. An investor seated across from Connor, a woman who managed a pension fund and had spent 30 years reading people for a living, looked at Madeline with an expression that had shifted from admiration to something closer to scrutiny. 2 seats down, a board member who had been laughing at the mechanic jokes an hour earlier looked away, suddenly very interested in his dessert plate. Graham watched the exchange from across the room. He had positioned himself near the press section, close enough to see Noah Price reviewing something on his phone, with the focus of a man assembling the final pieces of a puzzle. Graham recognized the look. It was the same expression he himself had worn the night he opened those archived files, and realized what they contained. Noah had received the documents. The fuse was lit. The rumors started before dessert plates were cleared. In a room full of people whose careers depended on reading signals, the connection between Connor Shaw and the name Shaw in old Meridian files did not take long to surface. Noah was not the only one who had heard whispers about Meridian's safety record. A regulatory attorney seated near the bar had been following the same thread independently, and when she overheard a conversation between 2 board members about the Shaw situation, she took out her phone and started making notes. Within 20 minutes, the name Shaw was circulating through the ballroom, like smoke, invisible to most, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to smell for. Hank Morrison noticed the shift before Madeline did. From his position at the back of the room, the same spot where he had stood all evening, watching with the patience of a man who had survived more crises than most people had meetings, he saw a journalist lean over to whisper something to a colleague while looking at Connor. He saw the regulatory attorney typing on her phone. He moved. He found Madeline near the stage, took her by the elbow, and guided her to a private alcove behind the service corridor. His voice was low and controlled, but the urgency underneath it was unmistakable. He told her that people were talking, that the name Shaw was being connected to an old incident file, and that if there was anything she needed to tell him, she needed to tell him now, before the press turned speculation into headlines. Madeline stared at him. For the first time that evening, the mask cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly enough for anyone outside that alcove to notice, but enough for Hank to see the calculation behind her eyes shift from offense to defense. She had planned this evening as a showcase of her power, a demonstration that she could invite anyone into her world and still remain the center of it. But standing in that narrow corridor with the muffled sound of 300 guests rearranging their opinions on the other side of the wall, Madeline understood something she had never considered. The mechanic she had invited as a joke might be the one person in the building who could end everything she had built. Madeline returned from the alcove with her composure reassembled, but the room she walked back into was not the same one she had left. The laughter that had filled the ballroom 2 hours earlier was gone. In its place was the low, careful murmur of people recalculating investors who sensed exposure, board members who smelled liability, and journalists who recognized the specific silence that preceded a story worth printing. Hank Morrison followed a few steps behind her, his face set in the practiced neutrality of a man preparing to deny everything while already planning his exit. He moved toward a cluster of board members near the bar and began speaking in a voice too low for anyone outside the circle to hear. But his body language was loud enough: squared shoulders, palms down, the posture of a man trying to hold a door shut against a rising flood. Connor saw all of it. He had been watching Madeline and Hank disappear behind the service corridor, and he had watched them return with the kind of forced calm that only confirmed what he already knew. They understood what was happening, and they were afraid of it. He set his water glass down, straightened his jacket, and walked directly toward Madeleine. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the same steady, measured pace he had carried all evening. The guests between them parted, without being asked, as if the room itself understood that this moment had been building since the invitation was first placed in his hands. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. The cameras that Madeleine had positioned to document Connor's humiliation were still rolling, and they captured every second of what happened next. Connor did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally reached the place where he can set it down. He told her he did not come to the gala to embarrass her. He did not come for revenge, and he did not come to perform. He came because there was a truth that had been locked in a drawer for years, and the only way to force it into the open was to stand in the room where the people who buried it were gathered. He told her that his brother, Robert Shaw, had been the lead maintenance technician on Meridian's Gramercy residential project years ago. Robert had filed a safety report warning that the elevator system in the East Tower had a critical cable fatigue issue that required immediate shutdown and full inspection. That report had been overridden. The elevators kept running, and 3 weeks later, a cable failed during a routine service call. Robert was inside the shaft. Connor's voice did not break. His eyes did not waver. He said that Robert survived the fall, but never fully recovered the spinal injuries left him unable to work, unable to stand for more than 20 minutes at a time, unable to return to the profession he had loved since he was 18 years old. And the report Robert had filed, the one that could have prevented everything, had been replaced with a sanitized version that erased the warning, erased the override, and erased Robert's name entirely. Connor said he had spent the last several months working inside Meridian's flagship tower, not because he needed the contract, but because he needed to see with his own eyes whether the company had changed. It had not. The same shortcuts, the same deferred inspections, the same culture of prioritizing timelines over safety. The notebook he carried in his chest pocket, the one Graham had noticed, the one filled with dates and serial numbers and inspection results, was his own record. His assurance that this time the truth would not be rewritten. The ballroom was completely still. 300 people stood in their designer clothes, holding drinks they had forgotten about, watching a man in a tailored suit dismantle the narrative of the evening with nothing but facts and a calm voice. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Then Noah Price stood up from the press section. He identified himself as an investigative journalist and stated that he had obtained documentary evidence corroborating what Connor had just described. He held up his phone not dramatically, but functionally, the way a reporter holds up evidence when the story has moved past speculation into confirmation. He described the 3 attachments he had received that evening: the original draft maintenance report with the safety warning intact, the internal email chain showing the override had been authorized at the corporate level, and the personnel memo listing Robert Shaw's name with a margin note that read, "Incident closed, no further action." He told the room that he had been investigating Meridian's safety culture for 4 months, and that these documents were consistent with a pattern of suppressing technical warnings to protect project timelines and pre-IPO valuations. He said his full report would be published within 48 hours. Hank Morrison stepped forward from the board members' circle, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to reshaping narratives under pressure. He called the allegations premature and unverified. He suggested that the documents could be fabricated, that the journalist was acting irresponsibly, and that this was nothing more than a misunderstanding being exploited for sensationalism on a night that should be about celebrating Meridian's achievements. He looked around the room for support for the nods and murmurs of agreement that had always followed his interventions in the past. But the room did not nod. The room did not murmur. The investors who had spent the evening drinking Meridian's champagne and laughing at Meridian's jokes were now looking at Hank Morrison the way people look at a man insisting the building is not on fire while smoke pours from the windows behind him. Madeline stood at the center of it all, watching the architecture of her evening collapse in real time. The gala she had designed as a monument to her control had become the stage for its unraveling. She looked at Connor, who was standing exactly where she had always intended him to stand, near the front of the room, facing the audience, visible to every camera. But the role had reversed. He was not the spectacle. She was, and the choice in front of her was the sharpest one she had ever faced. Follow Hank's lead and spend the coming weeks fighting a war of attrition against evidence regulators and a press corps that could already taste the story, or do something she had never done in 14 years of running Meridian Properties. She walked to the stage. No one announced her. No one introduced her. She simply walked to the microphone the way a person walks towards something they have been avoiding for years. She did not smile. She did not perform. She said that there were things about Meridian's past that she had allowed to remain buried, because acknowledging them would have threatened everything she had built. She said that safety warnings had been overridden, that reports had been altered to protect timelines, and that she had chosen the company's image over the safety of the people who worked inside its buildings. She announced that Meridian would cooperate fully with any regulatory investigation and that the original incident files would be reopened. She committed personal assets to establish an independent fund for worker protection and whistleblower support. Her voice was controlled throughout, and those who knew her best understood that even this confession was a calculation, an attempt to control the damage by owning it before someone else defined it for her. It was not redemption. It was survival, but for the first time, the survival required telling the truth. The aftermath moved quickly. Within the hour, Hank Morrison was approached by two representatives from the State Attorney General's office, who had been monitoring the situation after receiving a tip earlier that week. He was asked to make himself available for a formal interview. The board of directors convened an emergency session in a conference room on the second floor of the hotel and issued a statement before midnight. Madeline Whitmore would step down as CEO, and the IPO would be postponed indefinitely, pending a full internal review and regulatory cooperation. The champagne on the tables went flat. The cameras kept recording. Connor Shaw left the Meridian Grand shortly after Madeline's speech. He did not give interviews. He did not shake hands with the investors who suddenly wanted to speak with him. He walked out the same entrance he had walked in, through past the red carpet that was already being rolled up, and got into the vintage sedan that was still parked at the curb. Graham Pierce was standing near the valet station watching him go. Graham had already drafted his resignation letter on his phone during Madeline's speech, 2 sentences effective immediately. 6 years of holding doors open for a woman who used them to push people through. He was done being the hand on the handle. Noah Price filed his story the next morning. It ran with the documents, the timeline, and Connor's account, and it was picked up by every major outlet within 24 hours. The investigation into Meridian's safety practices expanded to include 3 additional properties. Robert Shaw's original report was entered into the public record for the first time. Connor never spoke publicly about that night. He returned to his work, different contracts, different buildings, the same careful hands, and the same notebook in his chest pocket. He had not gone to the gala to win. He had gone to make sure that what happened to his brother would never again be someone else's secret to keep. The room had gone silent when he walked in, because they expected to see a man who did not belong. But the silence that lasted, the one that settled over 300 people and never fully lifted, came when they realized he was the only person there who had earned his place. Not with money, not with connections, not with a title on a business card, with the only thing none of them could buy: